You're listening to the Vint Podcast, where we bring you interviews and stories from around the world of wine and spirits. From winemakers and critics to sommeliers and master distillers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping the future of today's food and drinks culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Podcast. My name is Brady. I am joined in studio once again by Billy Galenko, with the sun shining in the background and his Cabana shirt on.
Yeah. No, this is my post-holiday short week and weekend shirt. This is happy times.
No, it's just for the folks who aren't watching on the video, it's just a generic gray polo. But
hey, it's a button down.
It's a button down.
Yeah,
that's right. You don't wear polos.
You called my flannel a fancy shirt, and now this nice linen button down you call a polo. Jeez.
That's right. You're on the West Coast. There's no way you're wearing polos. But yeah, we had. How was your weekend?
Oh, this past one was great, and 4th of July was a good time. We went hiking up in northern Washington, which was great for the bulk of it. But then the last day we ended in Seattle. And when we were there. We were trying to figure out where to go grab a drink because a lot of things were closed because it was a holiday. May, I guess now I say my fiance, but she was basically like, "Oh, there's a whiskey place here. You like places with good amount of whiskeys?" I'm like, "Yeah, I do." Sure, nice. Let me look at it. And then I pull it up, and it's the largest spirits collection in all of the United States. And I was like, "Oh, what? What
was
is this?" It was called Canon, 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 but they have this picture of a cannon, so it's spelled wrong. But anyway, maybe it's French. Basically, so I looked at it. 4,000 plus spirits. They claim one of the largest whiskey selections in the U.S. It was an enormous collection. So I was like, yeah, we have to go to this place later. So basically, I made her and the group that I was with go, and luckily they had really cool cocktails. But they just had pages upon pages of cocktails, spirits, whiskeys. They had one of their things is $200 to $300 cocktails that are made of just vintage spirits. So they'll have 1940s bitters, 1930s gin. Yeah. So I was like, well, that's cool. If I wanted to spend that much, I would just get a whiskey, but I kind of want one of those. So I ended up browsing. I've actually posted this on a couple of whiskey forums, and everybody's like, oh, that place is great. Sometimes overpriced, but great. But I mean, the effort to find a lot of these bottles is tough. So one thing that I really liked when I was in Scotland, and I think it might have been a Springbank actually, was a Barolo finished Scotch. So I was looking through the list, and I found a 2014 Springbank finished in Gaia Barolo barrels, which I was it was a 9-year-old, and I was just like, well, this is right up my alley, and it's a lot cheaper than some of these other ones. So it still wasn't super cheap for the pour. I think it was $45, but compared to a lot of the other things I was tempted to buy, it was a good deal, and it was one of my favorites, and it was awesome. So that was a highlight. Definitely, if I ever go back to Seattle, or if anybody goes to Seattle, highly recommend that place.
Nice, yeah. That's funny saying largest whiskey or largest bourbon or whatever largest list, because I think we were in Louisville, and one of the shops we stopped into that last day after some of y'all had left. They claimed the same, and they definitely had a lot too. I don't think it was 4,000, but maybe they were claiming to be the largest bourbon list. I don't know, but it sounds pretty cool. That's awesome. This weekend we were down in Georgia visiting some family, and my wife's grandfather he was like, I've got a wine cellar. And I said, oh, tell me about it. He said, well, it's just one bottle. And it's a bottle. It's a bottle of blueberry wine from 1989, and it's been open for a while, but it's in the fridge. I just found it the other day. So he said someone that he knew had made it, and I said, "Are you sure it's from 1989?" He said, "Well, the guy's been dead 15 plus years, so I think it's probably pretty old." So the guy that made it, that is. So we went in and got it, and it was this. I forget if it was glass or plastic bottle, screw cap, almost looked like a old bottle of triple sec or something that they had taken the label off and filled with this wine, and I was kind of scared to drink it. I thought it was going to taste like vinegar, and it had some sediment in the bottom. And so I poured it and drank it, and everyone's staring at me to see what happens, and I it's really hard to even describe. The alcohol seemed like really high. The fruit was almost all gone. It wasn't like bitter. It didn't taste like vinegar or anything like that. It was really actually super cool. So I was really surprised. I actually couldn't even tell if it was fortified in any way. I don't think it was. It's just the alcohol seems so high. And could that be a product of it sitting around? I would think the opposite, right?
Um, no, yeah, I wouldn't say in a bottle sitting around, but maybe with the
Yeah.
sediment, maybe it was still fermented a bit in the bottle. And maybe it
I don't
finished
know,
off
but I
all the
was just
rest.
blown away that it was even close to drinkable, given that it was a blueberry wine that was, at least over 15 years old and maybe as old as, like he said, 1989. But I was just completely blown away. So either the guy's a savant at fruit winemaking or there was something else going on. But yeah, it wasn't terrible. You could definitely have, decanted it out, like filtered it out a little bit maybe and served it, and many folks would have been none the wiser.
Nice. Well, I know what I'm looking for my birthday this year. My birth year bottle of blueberry wine.
There you
I'll
go.
just
Oh,
get
is
it.
that
I'll
what
find
80?
89. That's my year. So I'll just I'll find that. Let me just give me the guy's
Well,
name.
it's taken them, over 30 years to get through half a bottle, so I think they could probably spare 100 milliliters if you want me to ship you some. But yeah, so that was my exploration. I think 4th of July. Oh, we had I had some Topo Chico, the mineral
Yeah,
water.
sparkling water. Yeah.
Yeah, sparkling mineral water in the fridge, and I had some Belle Isle moonshine from Richmond. And I have all this moonshine sitting, or flavored moonshine, and it's great. I just don't use it a lot. So I'm like, 4th of July is perfect. So I dumped out about a quarter of the Topo Chico, or drank it, I guess, and filled, like, replaced it with some lemon lavender moonshine, and it was awesome. Squeezed a lime into it too. It was really good. So that was our 4th of July drink. That was awesome.
Oh wow. Yeah, that the Belle Isle. I mean, I've had Belle Isle Distillery stuff
Yeah,
before, and it's good stuff. So
yeah. Well, yeah, maybe we should have them on. They have a pretty cool project. We've never talked moonshine on the podcast, but anyways, on the wine and interview side for today, I guess. Our guest Erik Asimov. That was an awesome conversation. We actually just got done it. Typically, we don't do our record our intros until a couple days after. But yeah, let's talk about Erik's conversation. I thought he had a lot of really cool insights.
yeah, we probably should have led with the fact that we've had one of, I
That's right.
guess, the U.S. foremost famous or wine and food critics.
Sure.
But if anybody's listening on the East Coast, I mean, I know when I was in New York, he was a huge name just because he was been so well established in the food and wine scene for years. But yeah, no, our conversation was really interesting. We were able to connect with him just by reaching out. He's a really, really nice guy. And what I really appreciate about his approach to wine and food is he's just kind of trying to learn. He's really open-minded to trying a lot of new things. He's not saying, I think one thing is best, so you should, take my opinion and go that way. He's really open to trying new things and exploring things as they're supposed to be, and sharing those rather than telling you what you should think about it, which I thought was great.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we had a little bit of conversation about producers and regions and kind of emerging trends in winemaking, and even some of the stuff that's happened over the last 15, 20 years, like globally and in the US with winemaking. But we also talked a lot about just wine culture and consumers, and sort of the different personas and age groups of wine drinkers that he thinks about. And I had asked a question about whether or not younger drinkers and older drinkers kind of had different maybe virtues or politicized ideals about how they approach wine, and he gave a really great answer that was kind of affirmative that was maybe some of the case, but he gave a really great answer about how, yeah, just the abundance of choice that our generation has had in food, but also, wine and spirits obviously has kind of created some different ways that we approach it. So thought, yeah, a lot of really cool things, and
Yeah.
that especially stood out.
Yeah, no, I think that was there's a lot of different points, but I liked his perspective there to your point on there is he we that was midway through our discussion. He touched on like natural wines kind of versus perception of more of the older styles, or what was the style back in the 90s and early 2000s. And he did mention when he got to the younger generation, it's not only, they had their perception of this was wine, and then now there's a bunch more options of wine, but then there's a bunch more options of everything. He was talking about cocktails, even coffee, and I thought about myself and was like, yeah, I'm the one asking, are these Ethiopian beans, or are they, some other beans? So it's like,
Sure.
it's really interesting if we initially had this perception of wine as this monolith, and now there are these new varieties and these new styles, and now people, millennials, I guess would be our age. I don't know if you're considered Gen Z. Just kidding. I know you're not. But
I thought you were a boomer.
yeah, my
with
beard.
that shirt.
If it was Hawaiian, it would be.
Yeah,
no offense to any boomers out there, but yeah. So I thought that was really interesting because it is. He's talking about, and he talked about the natural wine movement, quote unquote, in a different way than we've kind of discussed before. So I thought his insight was great, and with 35 years of wine writing, he's able to see a lot of different kind of trends and movements come and go, and to get his perspective was really cool.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Erik Asimov is a longtime writer for the New York Times, 35 years, I think he said, wine and food columnist. So it was awesome to have him on. We hope you guys enjoyed the episode. Here is Erik.
All right, Erik. Hi, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleased to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we were really excited. I have so many friends, like I was just sharing with you, that I lived in New York that we're really excited that we were able to you were able to join us on the podcast. So thank you so much for joining, and we're excited to really kind of dive in and learn about everything you've kind of absorbed. Not everything, we'll never scratch the surface there, but over the past 30 years of wine.
Wine and food.
Of course, yeah. We can't forget the food part there. Are intrinsically linked. Brady, do you want to kick off with some of like your
Sure.
initial questions, and then I'll build on those?
Yeah, I guess before we get in, just kind of to give the audience who maybe isn't familiar with your writing or just with you in general, don't want to go all the way back into your background, but maybe you can tell us about how you ended up writing about wine and food for the New York Times, and additionally just some of those maybe seminal wine moments in your career that have kind of kept you on that path and really grown your your insight and also your affiliation, just attachment with the industry.
Well, that, you want me to keep it short, but it's still a long answer. I've been at the Times, I've been at the food section of the Times for almost 35 years. And I was a food writer to begin with and reviewed restaurants for 12 years, mostly because, we've only had one wine columnist, and that slot was taken. And I've always been passionate about food and wine, and see them as linked. And how it came to me, I was lucky to really care about food and writing about it, and I was already on staff at the New York Times and really interested in becoming part of the food section at a time when most of my colleagues were much more interested in writing about politics or covering a war or something like that. So I was kind of walking in a different direction from many people. And back then, food and wine didn't quite have the same allure as it does now. So timing was lucky for me, serendipity, and also a certain amount of stick-to-itiveness and talent, I guess.
And you saw yourself primarily as a writer in those early days, or primarily as a foodie or a food and wine obsessed person, or which of those kind of formed your primary identity early on?
Well, I was a food and wine obsessed person before I became a journalist.
Mm-hmm.
but once you become a journalist, the two coexist very well. But the journalism has to come first. And back then, and still to a certain extent now, it's rare for people in the food and wine world to also be rigorous journalists. And I think it's important to be able to have that. And I'm very lucky to work at a place like the New York Times that still has both the desire to cover our culture in all its many forms, and the and is willing to finance that sort of coverage. That's the main sticking point that keeps a lot of people writing about food and wine from really being able to approach it as serious journalists.
How have you seen? What do you think has been driving more of the tastes, I guess, in culture that you've seen? Have you seen like food trends go and wine kind of follow, or have you seen wine go somewhere and then food try to match that? Is there one always leading the tail or whatever, or is it go back and forth?
It really works both ways. I used to think that food was always in the lead, and it is to a certain extent. You can see people who are super serious about where they get their ingredients, their food ingredients. They'll shop farmers markets. They will, demand organic produce or locally raised meats and things like that. But then they think nothing of getting a mass market bottle of wine. And they understand that processed foods are not only not good for you, but not great aesthetically, but they don't see the same thing about processed wines. So in that sense, food always seems to be a little bit ahead. On the other hand, and particularly in the era of our climate crisis, I think wine has a crucial role to play in terms of teaching people about agriculture and how agriculture impacts on the environment, the carbon footprint of farming, and how that can be eased in a lot of ways. Because people they may care about having an organic arugula or something like that, but they don't really make the connection between where that vegetable comes from and how and what the farmer is doing. Whereas with wine, it's this wonderful opportunity to have an intellectual discussion about soil, about forms of agriculture. I don't think the word biodynamic would be in fairly wide use if it weren't for wine. I don't think people would have any clue as to what that means. And so I think wine can really communicate a lot of the details about farming and agriculture and the environment that people might not have access to in other ways.
Yeah, it seems that from the outside, that cultural conversation around wine and food, it seems like it's able to go deeper and wider more quickly with wine. Whereas plenty of people can say the word organic about their produce or locally raised, but like you said, know nothing about the farmers. But that's the first step that you take when you gain additional wine knowledge, really, which I think is very interesting. Do you find that I know you said that wine is maybe leading, or food is maybe leading the culture a bit in that way, but does that make you, consider wine as maybe has an opportunity to lead the food and wine culture a little bit more because of that?
It leads in different ways. I think people have decided that organic food is maybe of higher quality than what you would find in the conventional shelves at a supermarket. But they haven't made that quality leap with wine, whereas people who really do care about wine already are very curious about how the vines are farmed and what exactly you're doing to the soil, what treatments you're using, whether they're permitted in organic versus biodynamic, and there's an opportunity to go a lot deeper with wine if you make that leap that people in food are maybe much less likely to make that jump.
That makes sense. I think that's how I perceive that culture to be, and obviously you're much more saturated in it. The other part of the culture that I just wanted to make sure we got into before, maybe we get into some of your writings and other sort of some of these cultural moments, is just the digital transformation that I'm sure you had to navigate over this 35-year period. Are there any maybe special insights or ways that you had to navigate that transformation, being on the food and wine side as you moved, from primarily print to digital?
Well, I would answer that in two ways. Just having been a restaurant critic in the 90s, where at a place where you wanted to stay anonymous, and my move was not to wear disguises, but just to kind of float under the radar and not call attention to myself. And that was possible in the 90s. Now with social media and smartphones, it's impossible. There's no way to stay anonymous. But from the wine point of view, it's been simply incredible and a huge change to go from basically print-centric universe to a digital universe, and the main reason is that back in the day, for English speaking for Americans, you basically had two sources of information. You had Robert Parker or the Wine Spectator, and both of which were rather similar in their aesthetic judgment. So you didn't get a whole lot of point of views. But with digital, you're saturated with people's opinions, and so it's really played a great role in decentralizing the power of critics in wine, and I think that's really been for the best.
I have one quick question. You mentioned how you did the restaurant reviews in the 90s. I have a good friend of mine who worked as a general manager at some of the nicer places in New York and then moved to LA and worked some here. He was basically saying when a restaurant launches in New York, you hear about like the restaurant group, the style of cuisine, the head chef, and then you almost always hear about the wine director, whereas he was saying in LA it's more about the chef and the food, and kind of the wine is second fiddle. Do you find that to be the case, that in New York it's hard to launch a nice restaurant without talking about the wine program?
You're talking about like in restaurant announcements and things like that, when Eater is listing restaurant openings, or...
Sure. Or like it's part of like, I guess, more the draw of like New Yorkers are looking for like, I don't want you just to have great food. I want to know about your beverage program as well. It is like, does it get as much shine, I guess, or as attention as the food?
Well, I'm not really familiar with the restaurant reviewing process in LA, and I guess, if your friend has experience with both, I would go with what he says, but I think that beverage programs or wine programs are fairly easy to summarize. It doesn't take a lot of words to very quickly describe the arc of a wine program, and it's if you ignore it, I think that's really you're missing out on a significant market. I know that LA, in terms of wine consumption, has become much broader and more diverse in its interests than it used to be. So I think that, if you want to appeal to a wider array of people, by all means, you should at least summarize your wine as well as your food.
Cool. No, that makes sense. That brings me to another question of mine, kind of spurred by a quote that I saw from you earlier in another piece. Was you were basically saying in the 90s and early 2000s there was a concern about the homogenization of wine, kind of like styles and kind of becoming very similar depending on even where you were in the world. How have you seen that kind of, because I feel like food not never, but probably had less of a problem with that because you always had different styles of food that were trying to be distinct. How have you seen the diversification of wine in the past 10, 15 years be kind of embraced by everybody, like you were just saying in LA and beyond?
Well, this is part of what, in my opinion, makes the last 15 years or so the most glorious time ever if you love wine. We now have access to more different styles of wine from more places, using more grapes than ever before. And I think that's a great thing. Why that's happened is really kind of a complex question. But if I were to answer very quickly, I would say that in the 80s and 90s, as more countries, more historic wine-producing countries were beginning to export wines to other parts of the world, and even countries in South America, which used to make wine for their own population, Australia, South Africa, as they all came onto the world market, it was very intimidating, and many countries assumed that whatever they were doing would not be appealing to other parts of the world. What they had to do is essentially imitate what was considered successful. You saw that in the United States too, when in Napa Valley, when they decided in the 70s or 80s what to plant. What did they decide? Cabernet Sauvignon, that makes the greatest red wine in the world. Bordeaux was the assumption. Greatest white wine, Chardonnay. So those are the things we're going to do. And what did the French do? Well, they age their wines in barrels, and so we'll do that. And you saw this happen in Italy, in Spain, in Portugal, at different times over the last 40 years, in South America, Australia. And then you had, as I said, the very powerful critics, small group of critics, kind of dictating what a top-scoring wine was like. It's very powerful, very oaky, made of these small handful of grapes, and you saw this mode all over the world, and it was kind of captured in the movie Mondovino. I don't know if that was before your time, which came out, I believe, in 2004.
Oh, I've seen it. Yeah.
and warned against this terrible homogenized future symbolized by McDonald's. That's what wine will be like in the future. Instead, it went completely in another direction because there was a parallel group of people warning against this, going back into the 80s. And various countries over time gained more confidence and returned to their indigenous grapes, and had learned what you had to do to make a good wine that you could export around the world. And by good, I don't mean imitating a French or American wine. I mean a wine that was not flawed somehow, that could withstand a long trip. You had to learn a lot of things, and that has happened over time, and it's still going on in different wine regions at different times and rates.
And so you mentioned that this was kind of happening both in the U.S. and just around the world, but the U.S. has probably come online as extremely diverse more quickly than almost any of these other regions over the last 10 or 15 years. Would you say that's the case?
I wouldn't say more quickly, but it's happened for sure in the U.S. And if you were to talk to European producers 10 years ago, well, the pendulum swing in the U.S. was already underway, but they were stuck in the mindset of 20 plus years ago, and just assumed all American wine was high alcohol, over the top, fruity and oaky. Yeah. And that hasn't been the case for a while.
Well, I mean, New York, obviously a hub for global wine, lots of access to labels from around the world, Europe especially, can be found in New York. Have you been surprised, and really trying to focus in on trends that you didn't expect that have caught on here in the U.S. over the last 10, 15 years among consumers, maybe, and maybe slightly more educated consumers?
I'm always surprised when I travel around the U.S. and I go to what, in my mind at least, are unlikely places, whether someplace in Texas or Atlanta or Birmingham, Alabama, or Milwaukee or wherever, and you can always find places to get good wine, whether a wine bar or restaurant, and so there are pockets of people all over the country who are really interested in wine, and the only thing holding back the growth or the kind of archaic wine distribution laws in the United States that prevent somebody, say in Nebraska, from buying a wine from New York or California because of some rule that was passed after Prohibition was repealed, and so that's always surprising to me. The other thing is just how good wine can be from different parts of the country, whether Michigan or Texas, Vermont, the Finger Lakes of New York. Where really great wine is being produced in unexpected places, and it's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, and from your writing craft, like thinking about this from a journalism perspective, just maybe asking you to paint with broad strokes. When you're writing, do you have? I'm sure you do have a specific persona or person and audience in mind, and how has that persona changed over that time period? Can you speak to that a little bit? And maybe it's different at different times, but yeah.
Well, there's two elements here. First of all, the New York Times audience is a general audience, so it tends to be people who are smart and curious, but might range from knowing almost nothing about wine, whose single interest is, if I'm going to drink wine, what should I buy on my way to the dinner party or something. And then there are other people who, in their area of interest, probably know far more than I do. So you're trying to appeal to this whole spectrum of people, and then you add to that the fact that wine is, in general, very intimidating to people, and for that I blame years of tasting notes and people talking about wine as some sort of intellectual exercise that you have to master before you can enjoy it, and trying to communicate in microscopic detail what a glass of wine tastes like, all of which have nothing to do with the way most people experience wine, and when that comes from experts, most ordinary people just assume they're doing it wrong or don't have what it takes to enjoy wine. So there's this whole so in my mind, it's somebody who's smart but may not know a lot about wine, may know a lot, on the other hand, doesn't really like conventional wine speak, and might be intimidated but curious. And so I'm trying to appeal to these people, interest these people, maybe even inspire them without being pedantic or wine-splaining stuff. And it's always a little bit of a balancing act. But for me, the most important thing is not like educating people about wine, but making them feel comfortable with wine. So when they decide they're interested, they will make the effort to learn more. Wine is not something you can force people to learn about.
Yeah, on that same note, I feel like, and it started maybe with the farm to table type thing, I feel like people are more interested in like where the wines are coming from and like the person farming them, and then that has led them into openness to more varieties than they've ever really kind of wanted to consume before. Because I feel like it's almost disarming when I say like, here's a Tyrol to go or some like obscure variety, and they're like, they don't have this preconceived notion of like, oh, I'm supposed to know what a Cabernet tastes like tell me more about it, and then they're more open to ask questions.
Yeah, and I think that's just the great thing, and part of that is breaking down this centralized power, which is not just about dealing with critics, but it's also dealing with decades, if not centuries, of conventional wisdom. So, for example, wine texts for forever have talked about the so-called noble grapes. And which grapes did they pick? It's like basically 6 French grapes, if you include Riesling as French, which, depending on who Alsace belonged to, was or wasn't. But the Brits who really created this list always liked German wine in the 19th century too. So, you had these 6 so-called noble grapes, and to a certain extent, a significant number of people still think of wine that way and those grapes that way, but equally significant groups realize that this is as this is an artificial construction. This is like an element of colonialism, the same sort of thinking that kind of made the English curriculums in schools very narrow for years. And now we're far more open to literature from other parts of the world, or grapes and wines from other parts of the world. And I've seen it again and again. The only thing limiting potential for a lot of different sorts of grapes is the potential that a farmer or winemaker attributes to that grape. So if you think Aligoté is only capable of making thin, acidic wines that you have to adulterate with creme de cassis, well, then you're not going to spend a lot of time trying to farm it. And that might go with a grape like Sylvaner or Teraldigo, or any number of grapes. But if you take that grape seriously and farm it with care and make the wine with love, you can be surprised at what the grapes do. The second limiting factor there is the idea of what a great wine is. And for years, that's also been a very sort of rigid notion. A great wine is a wine that will age for decades and evolve and become very complex, and nowadays it might be super expensive. But why should that? Who said that was the definition of a great wine? It's one definition of a great wine. And I cherish wines that are made with that purpose in mind, to age and evolve and so on. But that doesn't mean that a wine like that is always the best choice for an occasion. Sometimes you want a thirst-quenching wine, or just something that's going to go with a roast chicken on a Tuesday night, or there are any number of different occasions for which you want to have the best possible bottle, and those wines can be very different in nature. So I've also advocated redefining greatness in a wine to best for an occasion, so you can have a lot of different sorts of great wines.
Yeah, it makes me feel like it comes kind of out of the culture of wanting to have sort of the time capsule that is a older, an aged wine that kind of captures a moment in time and place.
And these are all luxury goods now, and they're sort of restricted in access is restricted. Mm-hmm. Not that you can't age a Beaujolais, but sure. there are other sorts of wines that you can age, but as they get discovered, the category changes, and they move from wines that you can easily find to cult objects.
Have you? Oh, sorry, Brady. I was just gonna hop in here and say, have you seen the quote-unquote natural wine movement kind of be a reaction to this? So, like, rather than something that's meant to age for decades, you're supposed to drink this within a year, or it could potentially, go awry. Yeah.
Well, in a lot of ways, but I also don't want to pigeonhole what a natural wine can be. There are plenty of natural wines that you can age and that are will benefit from aging. But my answer is still yes, because natural wine, yes, it was. It takes seriously how you farm wines and how you make wines. It's important to look at the agriculture and the winemaking and strip out the artifice and the I don't want to say technology necessarily, but the artificial kinds of technology. In other words, technology is great if it basically is just an easier way of doing something that was a traditional task. But technology is not great if it's transforming a natural substance.
Right.
Like electricity just makes it easier to, maybe cool a vat or something, or technology allows you to use a tractor. But where it's misused is where you start manipulating, adding tannins or enzymes or yeast that is meant to shape the aromas and flavor. When you're constructing when you're processing a product rather than you're just still adhering to traditional means of winemaking. But the other element of natural wine that I think is ignored is the cultural element. And this is seizing wine back from bureaucrats and marketers who, try to simplify what a wine could be, how it was made, what it would taste like, eliminate many selections of grapes so that people wouldn't be confused in their minds. This was counterproductive to cultural traditions, and the sort of centralized authority that I talked about in terms of critics also exists in among government agencies that oversee wine, and natural wine is a real reaction against that sort of thing. So, in a lot of ways, the return of indigenous grapes in many parts of the world has a lot to do with the natural wine movement that said, no, we don't. Just because you say we have to farm Cabernet Franc or Chenin Blanc in this part of the Loire Valley doesn't mean we have to ignore grapes that were grown here for centuries.
Yeah, it's been so interesting, and I think you touched on it. Like, I have friends who now they thought wine was too snooty, but then they discovered quote unquote natural wine, and now they like natural wine, and then they don't see that overlap of like these traditional producers have been making wine in a lot of care in the vineyard, very low intervention in the winery. So now it's kind of funny. I'm like using this as like an entry point to start sharing other wines with them. Producers doing great things that may not be super expensive. So I think as much as some traditional wine folks push back against the natural wine movement, I think it's actually helping grow education in the wine community as a whole.
Absolutely.
Is that what you're saying?
I think it's it's been the single most important driving force in the last 30 years about giving us the quality and diversity of wine that we have today. And just another example would be Bordeaux. So many people were dismissing Bordeaux because it came to represent all of the things that we can't. Sorry about that. There's somebody who's trying to deliver. It's New York terroir. Bordeaux came to symbolize all the things that people hate about wine: the intimidation, the snootiness, the Cabernet Sauvignon. The same idea. We associate Cabernet with Napa Valley and Bordeaux and Parker and Scores and traditional notions of greatness and connoisseurship. But now you're finding that I've never bought into that personally. I've always been a Bordeaux lover, but I especially love the fact in Bordeaux that the vigneron wine culture, the small growers and winemakers are have turned to natural wine or more natural in their techniques, and are influencing many of the bigger houses to move towards organic or biodynamic viticulture, and that's been like a major shift there. So yeah.
Yeah, and you wrote
And that's
some of this line.
I hadn't mentioned about natural wine. It's just like depedestalizing wine, which fits in with the eliminating this hierarchy of grapes and the hierarchy of how one has to talk about wine, or the status hierarchy of different wines.
Yeah, some of the line of questioning that Billy and I kind of put forward here, and specifically this topic, was kind of born out of a pretty provocatively titled article, I guess, that you wrote. The American wine industry has an old people problem. I assume, I know that the article's talking a bit about consumer trends and adoption among certain age groups and such, but also I imagine it has to be kind of tied to sort of gatekeeping some of these traditional methods of speaking, talking about, and doing wine. Is there a pretty strong connection there?
Well, it's a little bit. Again, it's everything is complicated with wine, but if you think of the headline, it's the American wine industry thinks it has a problem, and there's a reason for that. I mean, they think younger people are not buying, and let's even be narrower, the California wine industry, which is the people behind that report that comes out. It's a Silicon Valley Bank, the same one that nosedived earlier this year, that issues an annual report on, its take on the state of the wine industry. And it's been saying for a long time that younger people are not buying wine, which is not true. They're just not buying California wine. And there are some reasons for that. Partly it's because it's more expensive than wine from other places. But it's also because, for the most part, and despite many counterexamples, much of California, the wine establishment adheres to the, making wine to score, for scores, and keeping to those same handful of grapes, and making either luxury wines or imitation luxury wines, which account for a lot of the mass-produced California wines. And the younger people that I know who drink wine are just not interested in it. So if you go to wine bars in New York, almost all of which are populated by people far younger than me, 20s and 30s, millennials, they're drinking wine, but they're just not. They're drinking natural wines. They care how their wine is made, how it's farmed. Is it harming the planet? Is that something that the people think about? Do the companies think about the human consequences of the wine industry? All of these questions that I don't think come naturally to, certainly the old guard in the California wine industry are important considerations for younger people. So it's not that they're not drinking wine. It's just that how can we make our industry more appealing to people who are not choosing to buy what we're offering now.
Yeah, and it seems like both the old guard and the younger group has their own maybe principles and virtues that they value, and there's each side has sort of their own politicization, I guess, of wine and of the industry and the way that they think about the culture around it. Is that a way of thinking about it, or
Well, I think that's one way, but there's another element, and that is simply the fact that young people today have an enormous amount of choices, and
okay.
and most wine is still relatively expensive, and even I have children who are millennials, and if they're going to a restaurant, they have an option. If they're not going to pay $100 for a bottle of wine, they can buy wines by the glass for $20, which tend to be mediocre for the most part. And restaurants who are trying to, that's their cash cow, selling cheap wine for inflated prices by the glass. Or they can get world-class cocktails or craft beers for less money often, or the same price. And so they're discerning. They've spent their whole life like growing up. There are 90 different kinds of coffee and all these different kinds of chocolate and olive oil, and there are a lot of different hamburgers. What am I going to buy? And you have to you have to compete in this environment, and not just kind of think that you're going to get away with selling shit for big bucks.
No, that's a really good point. I also think, going back to technology, we have the ability to kind of quickly go through a wine list and look up each wine, and I can tell you if that wine is $10 at a store rather than $20 by the glass, and you're like, oh, that's ridiculous, I'm not going to get this. So
yeah.
What are you into these days? Like, what have you discovered recently that you're personally drinking, or a couple of varieties or styles that you would like to kind of share you've been really into?
Well, I'm like an open book. What I discover ends up in the newspaper, and
right.
So I've just spent 3 weeks in Spain, and the first of 4 stories has dropped already. That's on the unfortified wines coming from the Sherry region of southern Spain, which I think are just brilliant and wonderful and really appealing. And now is the time to get them, because they're only going to go up in price. And
it sounded so cool in that article.
And they really are. And this is what's happening in a place that made a big business out of selling like a shitty product. I mean, sherry historically is one of the great wines of the world, and in the mid 20th century, it kind of evolved from a product of the vineyard, a farmer product, to a mass-produced product that built a business model on big sales of cheap wine at narrow margin, like Beaujolais Nouveau. And when the bottom dropped out of that market, the whole region crashed, and that's what happened in the Sherry region. So you're seeing there what you saw in Beaujolais, smaller producers building it back up by making wines of extremely high quality, with careful farming and winemaking, rather than trying to just sell tons of mediocrities. This is a formula that's been repeated all over the world. There's really little people are not interested in cheap, shitty wine anymore, for the most part. Some people are, but people who care about wine don't care. There's always going to be people who are, and maybe they're the majority of wine drinkers, who really think of wine as a as an intoxicant, and just as long as it's something that tastes moderately good and is cheap, they're fine. But it's the smaller group of people who have gotten into wine, who really care about it, that sort of is the leading edge in the wine market, and they're not into the cheap mediocrity anymore.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've always been a sherry fan, and I've had a couple dry palominos from there. But what I think you made me think about a little bit more is, with the Alboritza soil, they really do have a unique terroir. So people know about the chalk in Champagne or the silex in Sancerre. They have a great story that they can tell in a way that they could kind of produce a unique wine and share with the world. So it's really exciting.
And Champagne is a perfect analogy. 30 years ago, all you heard about were the big houses in Champagne, and for them, terroir was a dirty word, literally, and figuratively, I guess. But they talked about Champagne as something created in the cellar by the master blender. It's not a product of the vineyard. Then you had the grower producers over the course of the last 20 years rise in visibility and push the bigger houses into to reacting by caring much more about farming and expression of place themselves. So that's all a good thing. And I've got a few more stories. One I'm working on right now, and as you travel in Spain, there's a time kind of at the end of the workday that people call basically la hora del vermut, the vermouth hour, where you just kind of pause and where if you're going home or you're going on your way to a tapas bar, whatever you're doing, you just stop for a glass of vermouth as an aperitif. And I've always enjoyed vermouth in that role, but I really got into it, and there's some great vermouths out there. It's a beautiful little transition moment in a day that I personally prefer to the 5 o'clock cocktail or something.
I 100% agree. We went to Sevilla in the southern part of Spain like a couple years ago, and I did the same thing and fell in love. Luckily, they just opened a place last year here, so I can get my vermouth in the southern Spain style. Anyway, Brady, do you have another question? I just wanted to add that bit.
Yeah, I'm always curious, just domestically, both in food and wine. You've done some writing here, but are there either emerging food trends, restaurants, or wine regions that have most captured your attention and that you'll be spending more time on over the next year here domestically?
Well, I'm super interested in people who are farming really progressively and exploring. There's the term regenerative agriculture that has become kind of bandied about as a way of building soil health and farming with the environment in mind and containing your carbon footprint by not releasing it into the air. But it's something that differs from region to region, and it's really sort of as far as I understand it, very much a localized concept that people are exploring all over. And there are different elements in that. Some people are adding animal husbandry to the farming process, not just in that sort of very kind of photography-friendly mode of trotting out your horse to, till the rows to show that you're really biodynamic. But actually letting animals graze in between the rows. And, some people will do this during the off season, recognizing the benefits of bringing sheep into a vineyard, but they won't bring it during the growing season because, there's the danger that the animals will chomp on the leaves or on the fruit. But some people are really experimenting with that as well, and just sort of reconstructing vineyards to, make them sheep-proof, for example, and finding that there are a lot of benefits to this, all the things that animals bring into a vineyard, from the fertilizer to the urine to just nibbling on. I don't think it's well understood, but it's really interesting. And so I've been very much drawn to people who are experimenting with these elements and how it plays out in the wine itself. And there's a number of people who are doing this in California, Oregon, in parts of the Northeast, and it's fascinating to see how people are returning to pre-chemical notions of farming without totally ditching technology, but as I said before, ditching the forms of technology that are either shortcuts or proven to be ecological disasters somehow.
Yeah, the focus is on, I guess, or like you said, efficiency and effectiveness of those practices rather than, using the technology to manipulate, which there are so many awesome examples of technology in wine that I continue seeing. And I don't know how some winemakers afford to implement those technologies, but there's a lot of really cool things out there. Erik, did you have anything else that you kind of wanted to leave our audience with? We really enjoyed some of these topics that we gotten into, but I'm going to wrap it up here. Is there anything that you'd like to share?
I would add is just to emphasize that this really is a great time in the history of wine, and if you love wine, it's really worth exploring all that's out there, and the number one way to do that, as I'm sure you guys know, is just to find yourself a really good wine shop and make use of the expertise there in just picking bottles, trying things that you've never tried before. And the other thing I would mention is that we spend a lot of time talking about the climate now in wine because it's really the single thing that's on people's minds in the many manifestations of climate change. And one thing that's just going to have to change, even though people are really reluctant to change it, is the single-use disposable glass bottle, because it accounts for the greatest portion of the carbon footprint, the manufacture, shipping, and destruction of these things. And we're quite wed to convenience in the U.S., and it's very easy just to toss your bottle when you're done. But that is surely going to have to change, and we may as well get prepared for it.
Yeah, thank you so much for your insights, one on the culture, and obviously also on some of the producers and regions and stories that have been shaping the industry over the last 10, 15 years, even over 35 years, like you said, you've been writing for. So really appreciate your insight and hope we can stay in touch and maybe have you back on in the future.
Thank you. It was really fun, and I'd love to do that.
Awesome. Thanks, Erik. Bye-bye.
All right, take care.
All right, that was our interview with Erik Asimov. I hope everybody gained from his years and years of wisdom. We will be back next week with another interview with another New Yorker, very different background, a deep passion for wine, another collector. So get excited for next week and have a good week. Cheers.
To check out our current offerings and to sign up for the Vint platform, find us at www.vint.co. That's www.vint.co. For questions, comments, or feedback on the Vint podcast, please email us at support@vint.co. Vint and VV Markets are offering securities pursuant to Regulation A. Our offering circular as amended can be found on the SEC website. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Investments such as those on the Vint platform are speculative and involve substantial risks to consider before investing. We may provide communication that may contain certain forward-looking statements that are subject to various risks and uncertainties. Information provided in any communications, including this podcast, is not legal, business, or tax advice. All prospective investors should consult a legal, tax, or business advisor concerning the subject matter of any communications and any offering.